Welcome back to Sensible 2020. I'm your host, Seth Adler. Humbled and honored to be doing this. Your next panel is You Say You Want a Revolution. Your moderator is Erica Darragh. Eric?
Hi, y'all. Thank you for attending this panel. So the subtitle of it is Racial Justice as the Critical Intersection of Drug Policy Reform and Climate Justice. And I will just do a round of introductions. So I'm, like I said, my name is Erica. I use she, her pronouns. I'm the board chair for SSDP, and then I'm also a trainer and organizer and hub coordinator for Sunrise Movement. And I will pass it to Josh.
Yeah, hey y'all, it's a pleasure to be here today with y'all. My name is Josh Alvarez. I organize in DC with Sunrise, and I serve on the Hub Council. And I'll pass it on to Sean.
Hey y'all, my name is Sean, and I am the lead trainer for the DC Sunrise, for the DC Sunrise Hub, and it's great to be here. Oh, I'll pass it to Dom.
Hey everyone, my name is Dominique Coronel. I organize in Chicago. I serve on the board of Students for Sensible Drug Policy, and I'm a co-founder of People for Sensible Drug Culture. Really excited to talk about the issues today.
Thank you so much. So we're just going to jump right in. Sean will take a kind of jump off at an introduction to Sunrise.
Awesome. So the Sunrise Movement is essentially a group that started in 2017 that was aiming to bring a sort of mass politics to climate change that hadn't really been there before. In the past, climate change was dominated by the idea of like polar bears and melting ice caps, but not about people whose homes were going to flood, and not like children who are going to have to spend the rest of their lives in a world that was hurting and dying. It's a youth-centered movement that is trying to make these decisions that will decide whether we have a livable future, whether the decades we have to come are going to bring something better or something not. Yeah.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much. And so I know I'm moderating, but I was also going to introduce, I guess, so in order to kind of bridge these two things a little bit more directly, the idea of so when we, where, I guess the first baseline question would be where does drug policy come, what is racial justice in the middle of climate justice, right? And so traditional within climate change has a racial element to it, right? There is systemic environmental racism, not just in the United States, but around the world. And environmental racism is a term that was coined in the 1970s when sociologists and political scientists and directly impacted people really started to draw attention to the fact that there are policies and practices and selective enforcement of regulations that disproportionately negatively impact communities of color. And for anybody, we recognize drug policy reform in general recognizes that people of color are so much more likely to be directly impacted by the war on drugs and mass incarceration, not just as individuals, but on a population level as well. And so, yeah, so a couple of general statistics about this are, in the United States and around the world, people of color as a community are exposed to produce less pollutants, but are exposed to more of it. People of color are, especially the Black community, is more likely to suffer from asthma, and there's a higher concentration of toxic waste and other industrial pollution in communities of color, because those are like traditionally more marginalized have less political representation and therefore have less resources to challenge those institutions. And so this is something that this is just for the sake of time, there was a video. I'm just going to summarize it quickly. This is something that is eminent enough that political scientists and sociologists have called environmental racism a new Jim Crow because of the systemic and generational effects of being of populations that are consistently exposed to more pollutants and have less socioeconomic mobility to escape those spaces. And so as anybody within the drug policy, or many people within the drug policy world have heard of a different new Jim Crow, and I will pass it over to Dom to introduce that.
So Michelle Alexander's new Jim Crow reminds us that we didn't end slavery, we just restructured it to prison labor through the 13th Amendment and made sure that those prisoners would end up being disproportionately Black and brown people. As a result of deindustrialization, globalization where jobs went overseas due to global capitalism and free trade agreements like NAFTA, in places like Detroit and other urban cities led to massive unemployment disproportionately for Black Americans who worked in manufacturing. So you had racially segregated and have racially segregated urban areas absolutely trapped. And imagine no jobs, economic collapse, manufactured poverty and suffering. And we, through politics, which is often known as the Reagan alignment, led by Nixon, continued on through Reagan and through the Clinton administration, prioritized not a war on poverty, but a war on drugs that was racially targeted. Black men were sought as disposable to the U.S. economy. No longer were they able to be slaves, or were able to use them as slaves. No longer were we able to work for slave wages. We outsourced that to Mexico and China. But we locked them up and trapped them in a cycle and used the war on drugs and other tough on crime laws like mandatory minimums to keep trapping them. And then we made it legal to discriminate against criminals as it once was to discriminate against slaves. Employment, housing, denial of the right to vote. We as a society can no longer use race to discriminate, exclude, and oppress Black people, so we use the war on drugs and mass incarceration and the criminal justice system to do that as a continuation of slavery. Once you're labeled a felon, even for a minor drug offense, you lose employment, housing, access to education, and public benefits. So we strip them of their civic rights, the right to vote, the right to social services. You strip whole groups of people of their human rights and their ability to make social change, be participating in democracy and in life. So as Michelle Alexander says, we haven't ended the racial caste system in America. We have simply redesigned it. When we talk about the impacts of mass incarceration, white people ask, what's wrong with these communities? I live in Chicago, where the dominant narrative is always Black on Black crime, which is dog whistle racism at its finest. And folks always talk about gun violence and murder, but never talking about the root causes of these issues. And it is mass incarceration, it is a war on drugs, it is poverty. In my city of Chicago, we closed down 50 schools on the south and west sides of Chicago where the Black people live. Children are losing their mothers and fathers to incarceration and addictions and growing up with deep trauma and no resources to escape. No grocery stores, food deserts, no job opportunities. But what they do have are high-tech prisons and overpolicing. So the impact of mass incarceration and the war on drugs has been staggering. As of 2008, there were over 846,000 Black men in prison, making up 40.2% of all inmates in the system. African Americans, there are more African Americans under criminal supervision than slaves in 1850. We in the United States have 5% of the world's population, but 25% of the world's prisoners. Think about that. Who is profiting from the system, and how can we stop it? And I'll leave it there.
Thank you so much for that. Yeah, and so we're just to kind of ground us in the second part of our conversation. I just have a couple of discussion questions for y'all. And so the first one, sorry for me and my three screens. The first question is, since the civil rights movement, and then especially moving into the 1970s, the mainstream political narrative has claimed to be colorblind. But obviously, all the data suggests, and lived experience suggests, that there's still significant racialized problems, not just in the United States, but around the world. And my question to y'all is how does this narrative contribute to the marginalization of global communities directly impacted by climate change and also drug prohibition, either or.
So one of the big things that Sunrise talks about is it wants big solutions. We introduced the Green New Deal, and the goal is to have large solutions that solve multiple problems. And one of the reasons why that is important is because almost every issue is connected. It might be hard sometimes to see where something like climate breakdown and drug policy intersect, but I've been trying to build a partnership with an organization in Guatemala that has a substantial presence of narcos, like organized crime that profits directly from illegalization, from criminalization. We tend to think of organized crime as sort of an underbelly of society thing, quote the dregs, but in reality, organized crime they serve the elites of society. They create relationships with the elites of society. They listen to the elites of society. The reason that they can get away with using government ports to ship their drugs is because they are willing to assassinate local environmental justice organizers, local indigenous organizers who are fighting for sustainable use of the land, who are fighting for protecting the ecosystems that literally all the tens of millions of people who live in that country rely on. There's a reason why there are so many refugees from Guatemala, and it's because the elites of that country are destroying it. And it would be much harder for them to do that if they did not have the narcos there to enforce their will. So when we talk about climate in Sunrise, we do it from a totalizing point of view. Like, there is always a way that adding a climate lens gives you more, or not even a climate lens, an ecological lens, a knowledge that we are part of the world that we pretend that we dominate. Using that lens will always add more to your ability to understand the situation. So yeah, fuck the narcos, or no, I don't know if I can say that, sorry.
Thank you so much, Sean. And it's Darragh, it's a really important point, right? Like the role that imperialism and the US's enforcement of its own laws on the rest of the world has really shifted geopolitical structures, the ones that are above ground as the ones below. Josh, would you like me to repeat the question, or would you like to go ahead?
Yeah, I can respond. Sure. I think colorblindness, sometimes people think that there's good intent behind it. People want to view people as equal, as we're all the same. But in reality, when this society, when the U.S. foundation of it is really built on the colonization of folks, there's a racial caste, right? There's a hierarchy, and even though we've been able to pass certain laws and policies to dismantle those systems, they still exist. How we spoke about the new Jim Crow, right? It's but they've been recreated. And I think it's the challenge with colorblind is that it doesn't allow us to have an honest conversation about race and the way that it impacts us and affects us today, and see the wounds that are still open, right? Is the things that still exist. So in the environmental movement, what's happened is that a lot of the solutions that have been pushed for have been led by white folks, but often what's the side come of that has been that people who have been the most impacted, like Native communities, Black and Brown communities, working class communities, aren't listened to, and they're the solutions that they have, for example, frontline Native communities who have been protectors of Mother Earth, who know the direction that they should go to, who use plant medicines to be able to heal their communities and themselves. And it's like we need to recenter ourselves and follow their leadership instead of trying to be the ones to constantly be the ones leading. So I think there needs to be an honest conversation about race and everything, and shift the conversation instead from equality to equity.
Absolutely. Thank you. Dom, would you like to share?
Yeah, so I think the question was about colorblindness and how that's detrimental to acknowledging a lot of stuff. And we often hear that we live in like a post-racial society because we had a Obama, a black president, and that racism is over, but racism is ingrained in our institutions, in our systems, and we have upheld and ignored really violent forms of oppression as a society. And you hear a lot of folks say, "I don't see color." But you have to see. You have to look at the problems we face in this country around poverty and crime, and how is it that we have more people in jail than any other country on earth in the land of the free. Most of these people, 40% being black men, and it's by design. We have very real problems in the United States, which didn't just appear. This is a culmination of centuries-long process, which has evolved with the same goal: oppress black people. Social and racial control for the profit of a wealthy few. Racism, has been used as a way to divide and conquer. It's timeless. And the denial of racism, or terms like colorblindness and things like that, it perpetuates these systems. And we have to be willing to lean into the discomfort of understanding how we could be benefiting from these systems, how they are mirrored in our own institutions, and maybe even realize that how morally and economically that we aren't really benefiting at all. We are all trapped because no one is truly free until we are all free.
Thank you so much for that. That's so true. And just for the sake of time, we had a second, just a heads up, we are, the second question, the modern youth-led climate justice movement recognizes the role that systemic oppression plays in dividing working class people and keeping us from being able to build power the way we have to in order to overthrow these political paradigms. And so if you have just a short thing, something to say about what are the benefits and challenges of explicitly talking about race and class, if you've experienced any in your organizing.
I guess I'll start. I think one of the reasons why it is so important to be explicit about these things is that they do make us uncomfortable. It can be uncomfortable to talk about these things, but in the end, the reason is because we've been shafting certain people. We've been shafting certain communities, and that's hard to admit. But if we don't make those communities heard, if we don't include them, these are the people who are most affected. These are the people who are the ones who are most invested in fixing this problem. It doesn't matter if we have a large amount of shallow support. There are plenty of things that have been popular throughout history that honestly Congress people couldn't give two poops about. What you need is movements. What you need is intense, active support. And if you want to get intense, active support, you need to be bringing in the people who are most affected. So if talking about racism and classism scares off a few Karens, I can live with that.
Very fair. Thank you. Josh or Dom, anything you'd like to add?
Yeah. So I think we need to build at the intersection of movements. And if we really, and at Sunrise we say is we need a mass mobilization of young people. And that includes across class, across race, across gender, across all identities. And in order to build that movement, we need to be able to have these honest conversations, because it is we are trying to dismantle these systems of oppression that the white wealthy elite have created and continue to benefit from. So I think it's important for us to build at the intersection of our movements.
Thank you. Dom, do you have anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, I agree with both Josh and Sean. I mean, it's about intersectionality, and addressing the climate crisis doesn't just mean shifting to renewable energy and solar panels. It means working to undo the harms of environmental racism and creating justice for the communities of color, Native Americans, people with disabilities. And when we talk about environmental racism, we're talking about Michigan, where you have Nestle taking money from taking gallons and gallons of water from Lake Michigan to tax subsidize for free, and Flint doesn't have any water. It's Standing Rock, where Native Americans, where we fought an oil pipeline that threatened their water supply and public health. It is my hood in Chicago, La Viejita, the little village, where industry is polluting our air. So now more than ever, we need to be intersectional activists and organizers in our own community. Collaborate with other organizations, go outside of our bubble, get off campus and really, work to see how we can build power with other social movements like Sunrise and Black Lives Matter. And it's not enough to say Black Lives Matter. You have to show up. If you have privilege, if you have race privilege, class privilege, gender privilege, use it to fight imperialism and white supremacy through radical, non-violent direct action. Go at the front get the front lines. Because the reality is, we see Black people get shot every day. It doesn't always make the news, but it means something when we see, my struggle is your struggle, and when we work together to build a movement. And don't look away, lean into that discomfort, reflect on the brutal systems, these brutal systems of racial and social control, and that way we can change our country and our culture and our values to one that prioritizes human dignity and finally humanizes the issues.
Thank you. Absolutely. And so, yeah, we have about like 7 minutes. So we had a video, but I'm just going to like briefly talk about the content. So thank you all for that so much. And like one of the common denominators we've identified is this really deep this cultural value system that needs to shift. And like, when we in Sunrise, when we talk about the climate emergency, we say that we're experiencing a dual crisis, right, of historic income inequality and a climate emergency. And in order to fix economic equality, we're going to have to talk about race, because of all the ways that systemic and institutionalized racism have been used to like disenfranchise people of color and especially Black communities for the entire history of this country. And so when we talk, at Sunrise, we don't just talk about the problem, right? We have our solution, and which would be the Green New Deal. And so the Green New Deal is not one single piece of legislation. It's a governing vision that promises dignity, justice, and equity for all people. And I'll hand it over to Josh and Sean to share some about the Green New Deal and Sunrise's strategy to achieve it.
Yeah.
5
Yeah,
minutes.
so the Green New Deal is a vision. It's a vision for a better world that we're all trying to work towards. And we have 3 main pillars of it. The first one is to stop the climate crisis, and we want to do that within the next 10 years. That's what the scientists are telling us, that if we don't act within the next 10 years, the changes and the impact is going to be really drastic, especially on the communities of color, frontline communities, Native communities, rural communities. So we need to do that within the next 10 years. The second pillar is creating millions of good jobs, well-paying jobs, that really ensure economic prosperity for everybody. In order to do that, is that we need to have a just transition, which means moving away from fossil fuels, but to renewable energy, to a new economy. And then the third one is establishing a second Bill of Rights. It's really to be able to defend dignity for all people, so that everybody can have housing, everybody can have healthcare, a new Bill of Rights for everybody. So how are we going to do that? One is we need to fight against the power of fossil fuel executives and the industry that has been buying our politicians for the past many decades, and it's really impacting all of our way of life. And we also need to build a large-scale mass movement, as I mentioned earlier, that includes people from across race, across class, yeah, people from all types of backgrounds, that is really centered and following the leadership of the most impacted. And then at the end is like, we also need to fight both racism and classism, right? It's like, it's racial capitalism that we're trying to fight against, which has kept marginalized communities from leading movements and working together. It's like they use the divide and conquer strategy, but we need to figure out ways to come together and to build a mass movement together.
Yeah. Sort of speaking on coming together and why it is that we, like, sometimes people ask, like, why aren't we just focusing on climate if that's our big thing? And it sort of speaks to Josh's point that up till now, like, we haven't come together to make the changes that we need to make. Like, the messaging has been tighten your belt, things are going to be rough, but you'll make the sacrifice for the greater good. But most people don't have any more to tighten anymore. There are no more notches on their belt. So if you're asking them to sacrifice more, while millions of people right now can't pay their rent, while unemployment is hitting 30% because of the coronavirus, well, exactly what's happened is going to happen, which is nothing. The only way that we're going to be able to make the changes that we need to every aspect of society, and that's what the scientists say, we have to change every aspect of society if we want to survive, then we have to make things better for people in the process. That's the only way that you're going to get people on board in a way to actually be committed to surviving as a species, because now we're not.
Yeah, for sure. So this time like flew really fast. So is anybody have any objection to can we talk about move to the element of like the mass movement side of it, where we're at right now? Right, Josh, I think, or no, Sean, would you like me to put the slides up for this part, or do you just want to say it?
You want to explain the 3.5% that we need, Sean?
Yeah, I would love that. I don't mind either way. So, when we talk about a revolution, one of the things that is, that people like to think that, like, civil resistance and like nonviolent revolutions are like sort of a gift from the powerful to like the wretched masses. But in reality, are the powerful, their power comes from obedience. The only reason a president is powerful is because people listen to them. The only reason that a military commander is powerful is because his soldiers listen to them. The only reason that your boss is powerful is that you listen to them. And when people manage to stop obeying in a systematized way, the gears of power grind to a halt. And we've seen this in things like the Arab Spring, where like in Egypt and Tunisia, presidents were ousted merely because no one was listening to them. They were in their big fancy offices and they were making calls, and the people on the other end were saying no. And that's all it takes. Research has been done into this, and it's found that when these sorts of like non-compliance revolutions have happened, none of them have ever failed, ever, when 3.5% of the population were actively organizing for that cause. So we don't need to convince like every single dyed-in-the-wool climate denier. We can drag them to a better world. We need 3.5% of the population committed, like really committed. And that, I mean, that's the max. We can win before that, but like, that's all we need.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and right now we have 77% of millennials who support the Green New Deal. And in 2018, voters under the age of 39 outpaced boomers for the first time in voter turnout. And in 2020, voters aged 18 to 39 will be 37% of the electorate. That's the largest voting bloc in our country. So we have the numbers. It's just we need to mobilize and organize our people. So we need all of y'all to get involved. And one way that you can do that is joining Sunrise. And we're doing Sunrise School right now. So if Erica, you want to talk about that?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, so Sunrise School, when it became really clear that we weren't going to be able to have our in-person trainings, we transitioned to this online program that has, there are several different courses. There's a Green New Deal and Coronavirus Crash Course, there's a movement building series, and then advanced skills trainings. And so, like if you just go to Sunrise's website, smbmt.org/sunrise school, you can sign up for courses, and it's a really incredible experience and way to build community, and to like make the most of this social distancing and quarantining time. Like we can be, in Sunrise School, we talk about this time, the pandemic, as kind of like an incubation period where there's like all this pressure building up, and when we actually are able to participate in direct action and mass non-cooperation, like we'll have built up so much power in this time. So like it's so easy to be like hopeless or afraid, and that's totally fine, but like we have work to do, and like we can work through that together. So does anybody have any closing thoughts they would like to share? We are out of time, but anything pressing? Okay, I appreciate y'all so much. Thank you.